New summoning salt. New summoning salt. Let's go. Yes, dude. Come on. W. Let's see. Is it exactly an hour? Because I have to go in 52 minutes. Hour 2.
This is Mario Kart DS.
Oh, I might not be able to watch it all.
Classic. Online racing, mission mode, retro courses, and non-stop action. It was extremely popular in its heyday.
Okay, I'm slightly speeding it up
against each other.
just
But
to
that
catch
was
up a
only
little bit.
20 years ago. Its popularity has died down with each new release in the series. These days, most of the world has moved on from Mario Kart DS. And yet, there's still a group of gamers who never stopped playing it.
Mario Kart DS.
There remain competitive leaderboards for Mario Kart DS. These are players who've poured thousands of hours into the game, perfecting their driving and setting world records on each course. And the best player of all is awarded the title of Mario Kart DS World Champion. For the past 20 years, the champ title has changed hands many times, as the best Mario Kart DS players have come and gone. This is the history of the Mario Kart DS champion.
It looks like it controls like double dash. Is that true? At least the boost in. No? I don't think I ever played this one.
And now a word from this video's sponsor, Red Magic. So, no matter how powerful you play, while the phone is in standby, you can play a quick game of Tetris or Snake to pass the time. If you want the best phone, I think
Tetris!
November 14th, 2005, Mario Kart DS is released in North America, and launched right alongside it is the Mario Kart DS time trial website. These fan-made sites existed for each game in the series. Players could submit their fastest times on each track and compare against others around the globe.
Nice.
Mario Kart DS has 32 tracks. Each track saves both your fastest single lap and your fastest 3-lap race. So,
it's
that's
quite
a total
similar
of
to Double Dash.
64
Don't listen to
times
people
racers
saying
could
the
compete.
drifting's different.
Players submitted their
it
times
looks like
via
it.
email on Yahoo groups, and the very first player to send in times was the owner of the time trial sites, Mark Jones. He was a competitive Mario Kart 64 player,
Mark
yet wasn't particularly good at
motherfucking
Mario
Jones.
Kart DS. But since he was the first to submit, he became the world champion by default on November 15th, 2005. However, Mark would only be champion for one day, because on November 16th, someone else submitted all of their times, Michael Freed. Michael was a veteran of the series.
Okay.
He held world records in both Mario Kart 64 and Mario Kart Double Dash, and was still ranked very highly in each game. Unsurprisingly, he was also really good at Mario Kart DS, and he started sending in world record after world record. So, how did Michael get fast times in Mario Kart DS? Well, like most games in the series, it's important to take good lines with
Holy
your cart
shit.
and avoid any slowdowns. This same principle is seen in every Mario Kart game.
Yes.
But Mario Kart DS has another important mechanic not seen elsewhere. Because right when the game was released, players discovered that the game's mini-turbo system could be abused. A mechanic known as snaking.
Okay.
By hopping into a direction, then rocking the D-pad left and right twice, you charge a mini-turbo that gives you a burst of speed. Now, in other Mario Kart games, these mini-turbos take a while to build up, and are designed to be used
that's just like
mostly
Double
on
Dash.
long turns. But in Mario Kart DS, they're much quicker. They take just 3/4 of a second to build up, and the boost you get can last longer than this. So, you can just non-stop charge
Bro,
mini-turbos
what is up
through
with
the
the
whole
cart?
race,
Why are there balls on
alternating
it?
between left and right mini-turbos on straight paths. You have to constantly rock your thumb back and forth on the D-pad through the entire race with little to no brakes. But if you can master it, it allows you to go much faster than normal. This is Mario Kart DS's most famous
Hi,
mechanic,
Carl.
snaking.
Dude, this shit is so fucking hard to do.
Thanks to his mastery of snaking, combined with his experience in other Mario Karts, Michael Freed quickly became the game's best player. By November 19th, he actually held all 64 of Mario Kart DS's world records. Now, this was only 5 days after launch, so competition was limited. but those who submitted times could not keep up with Michael. On November 22nd, a player named Christopher McMullen managed to wrestle the champ title away from Michael, but it was very brief. Later that same day, Michael took back the top spot, and then quickly made it back to 58 out of 64 world records.
Holy shit.
This dominance continued for weeks. While he couldn't hold all the records, Michael regularly held 40 to 50 of them. By January 2006, he'd been the champ for 2 months, essentially ever since the game's release. And finally, he began to see some competition.
Bro, Michael
His
didn't
record
fry,
total
he
started to
fucking
fall,
cooked.
down to only 38 out of
no.
64. Even though he continued setting world records throughout the month, he was still slowly losing ground. And much of that was because of one challenger. By the end of January, a man named Miguel Rodriguez had moved into second place.
Michael versus
and
Miguel?
were total opposites. While Michael was a seasoned Mario Kart veteran, Miguel had no competitive Mario Kart experience. He just happened to be really good at Mario Kart DS. Throughout January, Miguel chipped away at Michael's record total. By the end of the month, Michael's lead was just 29 to 18, and actively shrinking. That being said, world record total is actually not how the champion is determined. Instead, it comes down to something a bit more balanced: average finish. Average finish is essentially your average ranking across all tracks. The lower your average finish, the better. For instance, if half of your times were world records, but the other half were all in 50th place, your average finish would be 25. This score is much worse than a player who has no world records, but is in second place on each track. That's an average finish of just 2. This system rewards consistency above all.
Oh, I
The
like
goal
that.
isn't just world records, but to get good times on every last course. Any weak times severely hurt your score. So, even though Michael had a solid world record lead, Miguel had the more balanced timesheet, and as a result, his average finish had nearly caught up to Michael. And after a few more improvements, Miguel did it. He became champ despite holding fewer world records. For the first time since the day after the game's release, Mario Kart DS had a new champion.
Aw, shit.
Over the next few months, the game became more popular and the champ title changed hands repeatedly. In April, a player named Lars Stelzig briefly took the top spot, but the very next day Miguel beat him back, tied with Mark Jones for the shortest reign in Mario Kart DS history. A few weeks later, Michael became champion for the second time. However, his second reign would be much shorter than his first. Just 2 weeks later, Michael was surpassed by the number 5 ranked player, someone who would go on to be one of the greatest players in Mario Kart DS history.
Okay.
A man named Thomas Bolton.
Okay.
Thomas had been playing the game for months, but he was primarily a Wi-Fi player. This game mode was introduced in Mario Kart DS, and allowed you to race against others online.
But what the
Thomas played on Wi-Fi nearly every day, and he became simply amazing at it. It got to the point where he could beat literally any
Wait,
player
how long
in
are
the
these
world,
videos?
and he became simply
Daily Wi-Fi matches, part 180, 81. God damn.
amazing at it. It got to the point where he could beat literally any player in the world in a head-to-head race. But even though he'd mastered that game mode, he'd barely touched time trials. As it turned out, his Wi-Fi racing skills translated perfectly. Thomas finally joined the site in mid-2006, and immediately
I'm a good
began setting
player,
world
I
records.
think.
In a 4-day stretch in mid-June,
What a humble
he set
king.
10 world records, causing him to overtake Michael and become the new time trial champion. Part of the key was all of his Wi-Fi racing. It had made Thomas an extremely consistent player. While other champions had grinded tracks over and over to obtain world records, Thomas needed to be consistent on all tracks to always beat racers online. So when he finally started playing time trials, the world records came flying in. This was too much for anyone else to approach. They could maybe take a record here and there with heavy grinding, but Thomas's consistency was off the charts. He'd surpassed everyone else in the world, and not Michael Freed nor anyone else could catch him. On July 21st, the weekly news update was titled, "Bolton Unchallenged." He remained alone, easily on top of the average finish leaderboard.
Damn, by double? Sasha Brauninger. Yeah, I'm slightly sped up because if I'm not, then I'm gonna be late for a thing at 5.
Although Thomas seemed invincible just weeks ago, Sasha Brauninger was making a meteoric rise.
Oh.
Out of nowhere, he went from setting a record every few weeks to setting them nearly every single day. Thomas was playing too, but he couldn't keep up. He was still number 1 for now, but if something didn't change fast, Sasha was about to pass him to become champ. Thomas did his best, but Sasha's records kept pouring in. And after a flurry of activity from Sasha in mid-August,
Cool.
a new champion was crowned. What had just happened?
The Sasha Saga. Okay.
Mario Kart DS hadn't seen a player like Sasha before.
Yo, go ahead,
guys
thank you
like
for the
Michael
prime.
Freed dominated the record table early on, but competition was much weaker back then. Now, even against a player of Thomas Bolton's caliber, Sasha was able to build a big lead that just kept growing. By the end of October, Sasha had 28 site records, Thomas had 17, and nobody else had more than 6. Sasha and Thomas were a cut above the rest, but one was clearly ahead of the other. Sasha was not only good, but also ruthless. Whenever Thomas posted that he'd set a new record, Sasha took that as a call to action, and within days or even just hours, Sasha always beat him back. It happened time and time again. There was almost something arrogant about Sasha's posts. They often had a smiling emoji, like he was daring you to try and beat one of his times. And if you did, he'd make sure it didn't last long. Other site members were absolutely invested in Thomas and Sasha's rivalry.
It's a bit toxic,
There was a lot of
I
debate
fuck with
about
it.
who was truly better. Most were on Thomas's side. They said the only reason Sasha was ahead was because he played 20 times as much as him. They said Sasha had no life, that Mario Kart DS was his only passion, but the leaderboard didn't lie.
You have no
Sasha
fucking
was
life,
the champ,
man. Stop
not
playing
Thomas.
Mario Kart DS.
By mid-November, Sasha had become the longest reigning champ in Mario Kart DS history. But in December, Thomas made another push for the top spot, and this time, he took a different approach. Rather than chasing Sasha's records, he'd focus on all his other times, trying to get all 64 of his times into the top 3. This could still lower his average finish enough to make him champ, despite potentially not taking any new records. Sasha wouldn't have any world records to beat back.
That's smart.
It was a smart approach, and it paid off. Thomas lowered his times on track after track, and by December 18th, Sasha's 131-day reign had come to an end.
Damn.
And Sasha beat him back.
Oh. Well.
Despite actively playing, Thomas could only hold the top spot for 8 days. Sasha rattled off a few new records, and it was all over. He could do things that Thomas simply couldn't. And it just kept going. Sasha's world records came in on a daily basis.
Holy fuck.
As 2007 rolled around, it seemed like there'd be no hope of ever dethroning him. Thomas had missed his one opportunity. But then, in early 2007, there were 2 big changes. Change number 1, the replay code. You may have noticed the lack of video footage thus far. That's because Mario Kart DS's built-in replay system is horrible. For other Mario Kart games, the replay of a race has the same camera angle as the race itself, directly behind the kart. But Mario Kart DS gives you 2 screens during the replay. The top screen is like an action movie, aerial shots of the race that change every few seconds.
Whoa.
The bottom screen is just a map of the course. It's hard to see the actual driving with any level of precision, and when combined with camera quality back then, most world record videos from 2006 looked something like this. Are you enjoying this footage? No, of course you're not. But in February 2007,
I didn't get a chance
world
to think
record
about
holder
it.
B-Dash found an action replay code that shows replays as if they're live. This was a huge boost for the quality of Mario Kart DS world records, and going forward I'll be able to show you more of them. Change number 2, the PRB leaderboards were created. Back in December 2005, a player named Minsan found something called Prolonged Rocket Boost, or PRB. By getting the maximum start boost and starting a mini turbo immediately, as long as you're able to snake and preserve this top speed, your kart enters the glitched state of PRB. You're then able to drive off-road without slowing down. PRB
Holy
saves
fuck.
a variable amount of time. On tracks with no off-road areas like Waluigi Pinball, it saves nothing. But on tracks like GBA Luigi Circuit, it can save a few seconds. The key is that you can't stop snaking at all, or you lose PRB. It's very difficult, and was deemed to be a glitch, so it was banned from all submissions to the website. But in March 2007, site admins revisited PRB, and decided to allow it on its own leaderboard. Both PRB and non-PRB have near equal prestige, but since PRB allows for faster times overall, that's what we'll be tracking for the rest of this video.
Let's
So,
go.
this was the state of the PRB leaderboards once the switch was made. Sasha was still number 1 and Thomas was number 2, by about the same margins as before. Number 3 was a player named Julio, and number 4 was a player named Fabian. These were the 4 best PRB players in the world, but Sasha still remained dominant, holding nearly half of the game's records on his own. Thomas, Julio, and Fabian were all friends who talked regularly, and the 3 of them were getting really frustrated with Sasha. For one thing, he didn't always post videos of his new records, while Thomas, Julio, and Fabian typically did. Yet, Sasha seemed to be effortlessly beating their times, not letting them hold records for any period of time. It was almost like he was patrolling the forums, waiting for a new record to beat. The insults to Sasha continued. He has no life. The amount he plays isn't normal. Maybe they were right.
6 hours a day, that's not that crazy. Like, you have, like, Ouija out. I mean, I know it was a different time, but, like, you have Ouija out here playing fucking some 12-hour, 16, 18-hour days.
Or maybe they were just jealous. But it didn't matter. Other than one brief 8-day period, Sasha had held the top spot for the past 7 months. World records were effortless to him. Whenever Sasha saw a time was beaten, he could just pick up and play it to instantly beat it.
Yeah, that's why Ouija has record and I don't.
Then all of a sudden, in the middle of March, Thomas disappeared. He went from submitting times nearly every week to nothing. Nobody heard from him. And then, weeks later, the number 3 ranked player Julio also vanished. A short while after that, the number 4 player Fabian stopped submitting times too. One by one, the number 2 through number 4 players had all disappeared, as if they'd just given up. It was normal to take breaks, but for all 3 to suddenly stop at once, this was bizarre. All the while, Sasha just pulled further and further ahead. He had no active competitors, and his already huge leads continued to grow. But eventually, he grew tired of racing against himself. It wasn't fun with no competition. So, he too stopped playing. By mid-May, it was very quiet at the top, with all 4 top players inactive. And then, on May 25th, 2007, it happened.
Thomas B.
It was a sneak attack. They'd been playing all along, but secretly so that Sasha couldn't play defense. For weeks, they'd been setting world records offline. And now that they'd done enough to affect Sasha's ranking, they suddenly posted them all. And the end result?
Hoarding is like, isn't that pretty prominent in like Mario Kart in general?
If something like this were done today, there would be significant pushback, and the players involved would be heavily criticized or punished. But in 2007, most of the community cheered them on. They were excited about all the drama, and were especially happy that nearly all of these times had videos to go with them. In all, Thomas, Julio, and Fabian hoarded dozens of times, and took 12 records away from Sasha. What was Sasha's reaction to all this? Well, remember, he too was inactive when the reveal was made. But when he saw what happened, he simply said, "If I make a comeback, the charts will look a bit different." But the comeback never happened. Sasha only submitted one more time before quitting the game forever. The community hasn't heard from him since June 2007. Now 17 years later, his Mario Kart DS page remains dormant, likely never to awaken again.
Aww. Wait, is Sasha okay?
Like it or not, Thomas Bolton was back on top. And underhanded tactics aside, he was still a very popular member of the community. Thomas regularly talked to players on the forums and raced against them on Wi-Fi. But here's the thing. Everything we've covered so far, from Mark Jones all the way to Sasha, was just from the first year and a half of the game's release. Nobody had been able to lock down the top spot for more than a few months. Well, with Thomas Bolton, that was about to change. Although his rise was controversial,
that's a long
Thomas
bar,
became
dude.
the best player the game had ever seen. With Sasha out of the way, he was able to go on a tear, setting world records like they were nothing. And by September 2007, he held an incredible 40 out of 64 world records. That's close to what Michael Fried was able to do right after the game's launch. And now, in a much more competitive era, Thomas managed to do something similar. It was remarkable. Fabian was Thomas's biggest rival in 2007, but he could only hold about 10 world records to Thomas's 40, with the remaining few records scattered among several players. Thomas also set some of the longest lasting records in the game's history during this period. In April 2009, he got a Choco Island 2 lap record that stood for the next 8 years unchallenged. It was a masterclass in PRB, taking flawless lines while snaking until right before the end. And yet, despite all these records, despite having a huge lead over everyone else, I still call this period the reign of indifference. For one thing, Thomas still preferred doing Wi-Fi races over playing time trials. And when he didn't seem to care about his average finish at all. There were certain tracks he outright refused to play just because he didn't like them, like Rainbow Road and GameCube Luigi Circuit. which makes it all the more remarkable that, despite these preferences, he still had the lowest average finish by a mile.
Damn.
No one was even close. This pattern continued into 2008, as Thomas held on to about 40 world records. That summer, he began to get his first serious challenger, a player named Ben Stoneman. Ben's average finish began plummeting, going from over 7 in March to just 4.21 in June. And by September, it was genuinely getting close. Ben and Thomas were separated by just over half a point.
Stoneman!
However, despite their close average finish scores, Thomas still had an absolutely massive world record lead. Ben had a few world records, but all 64 of his times were good. Thomas had a lot of world records, while barely bothering to play certain other courses. In other words, Thomas was playing for records, while Ben was playing for champ. It was pretty clear that Thomas was the better player, he just didn't care. If he'd just play Rainbow Road, he could pull away and leave Ben in the dust.
Fuck Rainbow Road!
But he refused. What was it about Rainbow Road that Thomas couldn't stand? Well, it was one of the very few tracks in Mario Kart DS with shortcuts. The rail shortcut is done by jumping after using a shroom to land on the rail, ultimately skipping most of the loop. And the pipe shortcut is done by jumping off the road and fooling Lakitu into placing you further ahead on the track. Thomas had absolutely no interest in these shortcuts. He preferred a more consistent playstyle, like when racing others online. Shortcuts didn't fit into that mold at all, with very different mechanics to the rest of the game. So, Thomas's Rainbow Road time stuck out like a sore thumb in a sea of world records. Throughout the rest of 2008, Thomas and Ben remained deadlocked, as their average finish gap remained roughly the same. But in 2009, Thomas kicked it up another notch. In April, he increased his world record total to 46, while moving a full average finish point ahead of Ben, and it all reached a peak in October 2009, when Thomas managed to hold 48 out of 64 possible world records. That's 75% of all PRB records in Mario Kart DS. Just incredible that someone is able to get this far ahead on a game that millions of people had played. Thomas felt that this might be his peak in Mario Kart DS. He'd been the champ for 2.5
Millions,
years.
but how many are grinding this hard?
He didn't hold the record. Where else could he even go from here?
Few
All
hundred,
Thomas could
probably,
do was
right?
sit around and wait for someone to get good enough to challenge him. And he thought that might be coming soon. It turns out, he was right. Although it had been smooth sailing for Thomas so far, 2010 would be a much different story.
At least it doesn't.
This is Abel. Abel had been playing Mario Kart DS since release, and joined the website in 2007. He became obsessed with the game, playing as often as he could and learning from its best players at the time, Sasha and Thomas. He embarked on a slow, steady progression up the rankings. He entered the top 10 by
I didn't mean to, I'm not like undermining, I'm just saying he was like puffing it up with the number like millions, as if it's like millions of people
just
going.
kept getting better. And now in 2010,
I'm just a jackass,
he was
just give it to me,
officially
whatever.
a contender to be the next PRB champion. But there was also someone else. On Halloween night 2008, more than 3 years after Abel began playing, a weekly news update was posted. These posts talk about site activity from the past week, including ranking movements and world records. This week's update focused heavily on top players Thomas and Ben, and there was also a cameo from Abel, who at this point was ranked number 7. But as a footnote at the end of the update, there was mention of a new player who is improving rapidly. He was named David Roldan, and was still outside the top 100. What followed was one of the quickest ascents in Mario Kart DS history. Just 6 months later, David had made it all the way to the top 25. He had a very uneven approach to playing. Funnily enough, he was dominant on the one track Thomas hated, Rainbow Road. David held both the lap and 3-lap records there, while he lagged behind on most of the other 31 tracks. As quickly as he'd improved, he was mostly considered a one-track specialist. Incredible at Rainbow Road, but not a record contender anywhere else. But you see, today, 15 years later, David Roldan is better known by his online pseudonym, MK Dasher. And all of a sudden, in the second half of 2009, MK Dasher did this.
I know that name. Yeah, it is the. I know him as the task guy. I didn't know he was fucking goated at
majority of records, but for the first time in
Mario
years,
Kart Double
there was a
Dash.
serious dent in his total. All 3 players continued playing and setting records, and their average finish gap shrunk. But suddenly in April, Thomas said he needed to take
that's
a
what
break from
the
playing.
MK.
He was in school and had to focus on his studies for a while. This was Abel and MK Dasher's
DS.
big chance to take the top spot. Both players duked it out over the next couple months. That May, Thomas officially lost his record majority. The tide was turning. Thomas's days on top were numbered. And on July 7th, Abel made a grand reveal. He'd set 15 new PRs, improving all of his lowest ranked times. None of them were new world records, but they helped lower his average finish just enough. Despite only holding 7 world records, Abel had become the new PRB champion. The greatest reign in Mario Kart DS history had come to an end. But the battle wasn't over. MK Dasher was still actively playing. Abel had to keep going or risk being dethroned immediately. And sure enough, just 3 days after Abel became champ, MK Dasher posted 7 new times to bolster his timesheet. Then more just a few days later. He was already closing in. Abel had to do something quick. He posted a couple PRs on July 25th to stay ahead, but on the 27th, MK Dasher posted 5 of his own. And guess what?
Holy!
Abel's reign as champ lasted just 20 days. MK Dasher now had a narrow average finish lead over Abel. Through the summer, both players continued their dogfight, and Abel took the top spot back in early September. After 3 years of no movement, the champ title was now constantly changing hands. On the world record front, MK Dasher had about twice as many records as Abel, but Abel's consistency on other courses balanced things out. However, their record totals still paled in comparison to Thomas Bolton.
Thomas, do Rainbow
The only
Road!
reason Thomas wasn't champion by a mile was because of his outright refusal to play Rainbow Road.
Do Rainbow
His
Road!
ranking on that course had nearly slipped out of the top 40. The fact that he was still in 3rd place overall was a miracle. If only Thomas had been willing to play Rainbow Road. But now, he hadn't been seen in months, and his average finish was only going down compared to Abel and MK Dasher. And then, out of nowhere, for the first time in months, Thomas submitted a new time to the website. And guess which course it was on?
Oh!
He finally played Shortcut Rainbow Road. This wasn't an amazing time, barely ranking in the top 20, but it was an enormous improvement over 42nd place. This one time made his average finish drop by 0.45, enough to move Thomas back ahead of MK Dasher and Abel.
Damn.
The king was back on top. A few days later, he sent in more Rainbow Road times. This is what Thomas needed to do all along. Now, he had a decent average finish lead and a big world record lead. It was like a repeat of his last big reign. He seemed invincible to anyone else's challenge. However, Thomas was still quite busy with school, and after submitting a few more PRs in October, he once again stepped away from the game, potentially opening the door to MK Dasher and Abel. So, who would capitalize this time? Well, neither one was playing much at this point, perhaps a bit taken back by what Thomas did. Then in November, MK Dasher began submitting times again. And we know MK Dasher is good, but this was a totally different guy from a few months ago. He was setting a new PR nearly every single day, and as his average finish dropped, the community began to see who he really was. For months, MK Dasher, Abel, and Thomas have been trading the champ title back and forth. But now, MK Dasher was about to pull away, and do things that the game had never seen before. On November 8th,
oh no, is this a missed letter on shortcuts?
And do things that the game had never seen before.
Shortcuts. Maybe it's a different thing.
On November 8th, 2010, MK Dasher reclaimed the PRB champion. At this point, he had 16 world records, well behind Thomas's 26. But in 2011, he went on a world record spree, reminiscent of what Thomas himself did back in 2008. It was world record after world record. That August, he passed Thomas's world record total and never looked back. Even when he wasn't setting world records, he was still cleaning up his timesheet, improving his slower ranked times. Frap Snowland 3-lap, for instance, one of his weakest times in 10th place, he lowered by a full second, a massive amount for a player of his skill level, and good for 2nd place. MK Dasher now had a big average finish lead, in addition to a big world record lead. He was easily considered
2.4 to 3.7,
and the only guy who could maybe compete with him at this point was Thomas. But once again, he was nowhere to be seen. Thomas played Mario Kart DS for years, and now that chapter of his life was behind him. So, MK Dasher only had
5 years, that's a good ass run.
A player named Rupa. Rupa appeared essentially out of nowhere in 2011. He joined the site and almost instantly began setting world records. But perhaps more impressive than his driving skills was his innovation. He implemented small pieces of tech that helped him save time in ways nobody else was doing. For example, in Mario Kart DS, you lose a small amount of speed if you steer without drifting. Now normally this isn't an issue, since you're drifting through the whole race, but right at the start you typically have to turn to set up your first mini-turbo. So to avoid a slowdown here, Rupa started doing a neutral hop. He hopped and turned in the air just before landing, letting him change his direction while preserving his forward momentum. He also started doing neutral hops at the end of some laps. After the last mini-turbo, instead of steering to face the finish line, Rupa started hopping without turning to preserve his forward speed. These were small time saves, but when combined with
That's
incredible
massive,
driving,
brain. Holy
Rupa
shit.
was able to build up a number of world records. He peaked in May 2012, with an impressive 13 of them. But just like Thomas Bolton, there were a number of courses he didn't care to play, so he was never much of a threat to take the champ title from MK Dasher. Then in 2013, Mario Kart DS entered a very inactive period. The game was 8 years old at this point, and its popularity had gradually died down while games like Mario Kart Wii took over. During its heyday in 2006, nearly 1,800 world records were set across the year.
Damn.
In 2013, that number was down to just 44. Most players had moved on, and even MK Dasher was playing much less than he used to. Despite the inactivity, players still set a handful of records, but they didn't put much of a dent in MK Dasher's record total. And that was the state of Mario Kart DS in the spring of 2014. MK Dasher was still the champ, but overall activity was very light. Perhaps the game just needed some kind of a spark. Other than snaking, Mario Kart DS had a reputation as one of the least broken Mario Karts. Only 3 out of its 32 tracks had shortcuts, and most of those were very minor. But now, 7 years after the last shortcut discovery, shortcut number 4 was found, on Mario Circuit. On April 9th, 2014, Folk and his friend Toa found that by driving toward this wall with speed, then hopping on this raised slope, you could get enough air to land on top of the wall. It was quickly found that you could clear the wall entirely and use this as a shortcut, cutting out a bend to save about a second and a half. Now, this wasn't a very big time save, but it was enough that you had to get a time with this shortcut, or else your rank would fall way behind and hurt your average finish. And sure enough, within days, MK Dasher was back and setting new records on Mario Circuit. His first submissions to the site in over a year. It rejuvenated his love of the game, and he began playing more than ever, like grinding for the first sub 1 on Sky Garden. He even found his own new shortcut on Rainbow Road, the Loop shortcut, a faster and easier replacement for the Rail shortcut.
Wow.
MK Dasher was more active than he'd been in years. His world record lead had increased, and his average finish was leaps ahead of anyone else. At this point, he'd already been the champ for nearly 4 years, and although he'd faltered slightly while taking a break, his lead was once again growing and he'd separated from others again. How long could this go on? Could anybody catch MK Dasher? Then, in June 2014, there was an unexpected post on the forums. Thomas Bolton was back. Over the last
Bolton
4
is
years,
back!
Thomas had barely touched Mario Kart DS. But since the game's official Wi-Fi servers were shutting down, Thomas wanted to come back and play a bit more. And this time, he was going to focus heavily on playing time trials. Now look, Thomas had been a dominant champ back in 2008, but that was years ago. He'd been passed up by MK Dasher. How good could Thomas be in 2014? Could he still set world records?
Is he washed?
Thomas Bolton came back out of nowhere, set 8 world records in just over a week, and beat MK Dasher to take back the champ title. His skills hadn't gone anywhere. In fact, he was playing better than he'd ever been. This was despite
I can't
not
restart the
playing
video, man,
competitively
sorry.
at all in over 4 years. Although he'd resisted shortcuts in the past, Thomas decided to try the new ones on Mario Circuit and Rainbow Road. And he actually posted respectable times, as high as 6th place on Rainbow Road and 3rd place on Mario Circuit. But even more important, Thomas was directly out-dueling MK Dasher on some of these records. For instance, in June, MK Dasher had set a new lap record on Donut Plains with some minor strategy changes. But when Thomas returned, he decided to play it too, and beat the time that MK Dasher had just posted. He got the record, and it ultimately helped him pass MK Dasher for champ. Thomas and MK Dasher were both extremely active over the following months, as they each set world record after world record. These two stood head and shoulders above the rest. They had 41 records between them, while nobody else had more than 8. This was a beautiful period for Mario Kart DS. The two best players the game had ever seen, battling it out and trading the champ title back and forth. But all good things must come to an end. While the summer months of 2014 had rampant record activity, by the end of the year things had slowed down. And by early 2015, the dust had more or less settled. Thomas was just ahead of MK Dasher as the PRB champion, but they were now both inactive, sitting alone at the top, holding a majority of the game's records. 2015 was another quiet year for Mario Kart DS. Thomas was in the middle of his 7th reign as champ, but he wasn't actively defending his title. So, the door was open for somebody new to make a move. And that summer, guess who made a charge toward the top spot?
Miguel? Mark Jones? What?
That's right. It was Ben Stoneman.
Oh.
You might remember Ben from 2008, when he got fairly close to Thomas but couldn't quite get there. That was kind of the story for Ben. Always in the top 5, but never the champ. But with both players ahead of him out of the way, Ben saw a chance to move up. He set a number of PRs that beat Thomas but not MK Dasher, causing MK Dasher to briefly move ahead of Thomas for champion. But Ben kept going, eyeing the top spot for himself. That October, he took the Luigi's Mansion lap and 3-lap records, and it was enough to push him over the top. For the first time in 5 years, someone other than Thomas or MK Dasher was the PRB champion of Mario Kart DS.
Okay.
Now, part of the reason Ben was on top was because of other players in activity, but he was still an incredible player in his own right. Of the 35 records set in 2015, Ben did more than half of them. He also set 21 total records during his reign as champ, and on some courses he was flat out dominant, like Luigi's Mansion and Yoshi Circuit. He lowered the records repeatedly on these courses.
What
and
is
for years,
flap?
nobody could touch him, not even Thomas or MK Dasher. Throughout 2016, there was very
Fastest
little movement.
lap?
Ben was the only active top player, and he had a small but stable lead in average finish. But it's worth noting that Ben was considered a little weaker than the champs right before him. Thomas and MK Dasher were both inactive, and he'd taken advantage of the opportunity. Ben still had a very strong timesheet, but he didn't have that many world records. It was generally believed that if either Thomas or MK Dasher came back, Ben's status as champion would be very vulnerable. And then, for the first time in 2 years, MK Dasher set a world record. It was on GameCube Luigi Circuit, thanks to a new strategy developed by Toa. In the description, he said he had a bit of free time this summer to play Mario Kart DS again, but don't expect a long comeback. Well, 2 weeks later, after world records on Luigi's Circuit and Luigi's Mansion, MK Dasher had beaten Ben Stoneman. And over the next month, he set records on Peach Circuit, Choco Island 2, Koopa Beach 2, and Rainbow Road. MK Dasher hadn't missed a beat in the last 3 years. In fact, it seemed like he was playing even better than before. He was setting world records with an ease that he'd never had. By late August, he was up to 22 world records.
God damn.
That fall, his world record quest continued. MK Dasher was gaining record after record, and he just kept going. This was MK Dasher at his absolute best. He had no challengers. This continued through all of 2018, and by June of 2019, MK Dasher held 35 world records, the most records any one person had held since Thomas Bolton in 2010. Of these 35 records, 2 of them stood out above the rest, because they were the 2 longest lasting world records in the game's history. The first was MK Dasher's Shroom Ridge 3-lap record, set way back in August 2009. Shroom Ridge is a uniquely difficult course. First off, it's one of the longest tracks in the game. It also has cars all over that you need to avoid, making ideal lines harder. There's upward and downward slopes that affect mini-turbos, and it's extremely hard to keep PRB so you can drive over the grass in the middle section. In August 2009, MK Dasher got a 137.856, a really good race that took risky lines between the vehicles and the wall, and it stood as the world record throughout the long reigns of Thomas Bolton, Ben Stoneman, and MK Dasher himself. Players got close over the years, but nobody could quite get there. Finally, in September 2020, Max beat the record after an 11-year reign on top.
God damn.
Only for MK Dasher to beat him back just 7 days later.
Holy shit.
His other long-lasting record was the Sky Garden lap record from February 2010. This is one of the few tracks in the game with a shortcut. You have to keep PRB, press R to hop at the last moment, then shroom and precisely navigate to recover speed. MK Dasher was easily the best player at this shortcut, which is why his 18.757 lap also stood for 11 years. In May 2021, it was finally beaten by Boreas, and this time it took MK Dasher longer than 7 days to beat him back. It took him 8 days. Nobody
Bro, he
else
beat it
came
by
close to MK Dasher. In the past,
0.002.
even when he was the champ, he had competition like Thomas or Ben. But now, there was really nobody. He held a majority of world records, and had been the champ for the past 3 years with a massive lead. MK Dasher seemed untouchable. But who are we kidding? We've seen this before. No matter how dominant the champ, no matter how amazing the player, nobody stays on top forever.
It's true. Oh?
On the evening of September 20th, 2020, a player named Mikiri posted in Discord that he'd stumbled upon somebody new. This person's name was Taiga, and he just posted a video of a 156 on Waluigi Pinball. That was an incredible time, and good for second place overall. Nobody had heard of this guy before. Taiga hadn't submitted to the site and showed no progression of his times.
Yeah, that name does sound familiar.
There was just a near world record sitting on his YouTube page, with no elaboration. Over the next week, a couple more of these elite level times popped up on Taiga's channel, including a second place time on Sky Garden. And then, on September 25th, Taiga uploaded another one. He had just beaten MK Dasher's Bowser Castle world record. That same day, he posted a video scrolling through his PRs on each course, and it showed that he had an elite time on nearly every track in the game, including 4 world records. Who was this guy? Where did he come from? Taiga had just suddenly popped up with no progression or prior community contact and beaten 4 world records held by the game's very best players. These were veterans who'd been playing the game for years, and he'd beaten their times like it was nothing. Oh, and one other important thing to note, Taiga was 11 years old. Taiga's videos were uploaded by his parents, who said in the description that he was in 6th grade. And most of the community realized this had to be a prank. There was no way an 11-year-old could come along and single-handedly take down times that a community of veterans had played for years to achieve, right? I mean, some of these guys had been playing since before Taiga was allegedly born. These videos were either faked or played by some veteran who was trolling the community. But when they asked for proof, Taiga responded with a hand cam video showing it really was him playing. This was actually real. An 11-year-old had somehow become one of the best Mario Kart DS players on Earth, and he was beating records that were set when he was a toddler. Although there was limited footage of him driving, top players could tell that Taiga had inhuman consistency. He was also playing with the 3DS Circle Pad, which was virtually unheard of among top players. Taiga only had 4 world records, but it was clear that he had the potential to get way more, perhaps even enough to rival MK Dasher. But nobody knew what would happen next. Would Taiga fade away, or keep setting records? Well, Taiga did indeed keep playing. By the end of 2020, he'd increased his record total from 4 to 6. It wasn't the world record domination that some had predicted, but he was still hanging on to his fair share of records.
Okay.
Maybe climbing all the way to the top was unrealistic for 11-year-old Taiga, but he'd carved out a niche for himself in the Mario Kart DS community. Or maybe he was just getting started.
Oh shit, he's coming. Oh, he coming. Oh shit.
Taiga had ascended the mountain. After 9 months of heavy playing in 2021, he'd nearly made it to the top. All the while, MK Dasher was playing and setting his own world records, but he kept losing ground to Taiga. For every record that he set, Taiga got multiple others, and the result was the complete erosion of his world record lead. On September 17th, 2021, it officially happened. Taiga passed MK Dasher's record count. But was this enough to make him the champ? How did his average finish compare to MK Dasher? Well, overall, Taiga had an incredible timesheet. If he didn't have the record on a course, he was usually in 2nd place. One notable exception. These were his Moo Moo Farm ranks. Taiga was pretty disconnected from the rest of the community and seemed to not care at all about average finish. So, even though he'd passed MK Dasher in nearly every metric, Moo Moo Farm prevented him from officially being champ. MK Dasher still held the crown. By late 2021, MK Dasher gave up trying to compete with Taiga. He realized it was a pointless endeavor. Instead, he focused on grinding individual tracks he enjoyed, like Rainbow Road, lowering these records over and over. He knew his champ status could disappear at any moment. Meanwhile, Taiga kept playing too, setting new records while also lowering ones he already had. By mid-2022, his world record lead had grown, despite still not technically being the champ. And then, in October 2022, it happened. Taiga played Moo Moo Farm. It was far from perfect. On his 3-lap time, he missed a mini-turbo and hit a wall at the end. But his driving was still incredible overall. He improved his times from outside the top 150 to 3rd place. And finally, it was made official. Taiga was the champion of Mario Kart DS.
Let's go! God
Could MK Dasher
damn.
respond? Well, in 2023, he went all in, doing everything he could to close the gap between himself and Taiga. But no matter what MK Dasher did, he remained 5 to 10 world records behind Taiga. Even when he managed to beat a few of Taiga's records, Mario Circuit 1, Donut Plains 1, Figure 8 Circuit, Taiga always beat him back in a matter of weeks. It was reminiscent of what Sasha did to Thomas back in 2007. Before MK Dasher knew it, his progress was always undone. He then turned to cleaning up his timesheet instead of chasing world records. This helped close the average finish gap somewhat, but Taiga still had a comfortable lead. This continued throughout all of 2023. Both players were active and improving their PRs. By early 2024, Taiga had been on top for a year and a half, and despite MK Dasher's best effort, he hadn't been able to pose much of a threat. That was the status quo, all the way until April 2024, when there was a revolution. On April 5th, 2024, someone new popped up in the Mario Kart DS Discord server, Zumo de Papaya. Right away, he started asking about a potential glitch on
3 months ago?
He was wondering if it was somehow possible to bounce high enough to clip through the wall and down to the floor below. Players had already seen bounces like this before. They weren't consistent enough or big enough for anything meaningful. But Zumo was an experienced glitch hunter. He knew what he was doing. And as he kept experimenting with different angles and steering, his bounces began to get higher. Other players started to take notice, and one named Guan began experiments of his own. A few hours later, Guan posted that he had done it. He'd bounced over the wall and clipped down to later in the track. This was Mario Kart DS's first new shortcut in more than 10 years, and it was about to kick off a revolution of new shortcuts, all revolving around this one technique, the super bounce. Here's how it's done. You must angle your kart back in the air while falling, press R on the frame you land next to a wall, then steer perpendicular to said wall. This allows you to get massive air and potentially skip certain sections of the track. The super bounce opens up the door to many new shortcuts, but it's limited somewhat because of the game's checkpoint system. Each track has a number of key checkpoints you must drive through, and if you miss one, the lap won't count. So, if your super bounce causes you to miss a key checkpoint, you won't complete a lap upon crossing the finish line.
Okay.
Ultimately, Zumo, Guan, and others collaborated to find 3 new shortcuts using the super bounce. The first new RTA viable shortcuts since 2014. The first was on Luigi's Mansion, which you've already seen. It saves about 1.5 seconds and is also the hardest of the 3 shortcuts. You can see you're not skipping any key checkpoints by cutting out this section of the track, so the lap counts. The second shortcut was on Delfino Square, and used an idea theorized years ago by a player known as Nine. You jump off the lip, hit the bridge to bounce and tilt your kart back, then super bounce over the wall to skip a section of the track.
Holy shit.
Just like Luigi's Mansion, this shortcut also saves about 1.5 seconds. But the biggest time save of the 3 shortcuts, and also by far the easiest, was on Waluigi Pinball. It's performed after a long fall from a zipper, and by using a mushroom, you can make it all the way to the bottom of the pinball machine. It saves close to 9 seconds per lap, blowing the other 2 shortcuts out of the water. The Waluigi Pinball shortcut was first hit in the world record by iMathy on April 13th. iMathy is a Mario Kart shortcut aficionado, who's hit shortcut world records in several Mario Kart games. It only made sense that he'd be the first to hit this one in Mario Kart DS. But what about our world champions? They were used to incredibly fast racing without shortcuts. How did they adapt to the super bounce? Well, Taiga did briefly take the Waluigi Pinball lap record, but there's no footage of him ever using the shortcuts on Delfino Square or Luigi's Mansion. He did manage to hit a new lap shortcut on GameCube Luigi Circuit, but for the most part, he's stuck to non-shortcut racing recently. MK Dasher, on the other hand, well, he got good at the super bounce. At times, he's held all 6 shortcut records across the 3 super bounce courses. He's mastered the shortcuts themselves, and when combined with his driving skills, he can outmatch nearly any player in the world on these courses. The shortcut revolution has given MK Dasher a leg up on Taiga, and as a result, it's brought him right back into the competition. On April 14th, MK Dasher took the champ title from Taiga, and ever since then, they've been trading it back and forth. As of now, MK Dasher is officially the PRB champ.
Damn!
He holds a very slight lead over Taiga, thanks in large part to his shortcut records. Their rivalry is stronger than ever. They hold a combined 61 out of the game's 64 world records. And as exciting as their futures will be, it's just a small part of Mario Kart DS's history. These are the best players to ever touch Mario Kart DS. Their records, their struggles, and their stories live on, and they'll remain a part of this game's legacy forever. Thanks for watching. For a behind-the-scenes look at how I made this video and storylines that I couldn't include, join my Patreon page. I only charge when I upload a video. Thanks.
Another classic dub from Mr. Summoning Salt. Bro, that's crazy how young he was. Like, young people getting into shit is not a new thing, but that young, 11, holy shit. That's insane. I didn't know MK Dasher was so fucking cracked. Like, I first heard of MK Dasher from, like, is there... Like, I know that he's been... he does task stuff. Oh, here's my reacting. Did he work on this? Videos made by MK Dasher, Nahawk. Like, he worked on Mario 64 tasks. That's really cool. And he's still good.